Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. In this slow time for the bodybuilding season, I want to continue to do some more comparisons that aren't really that relevant, but are still very worthwhile and interesting. And I want to do something I don't do very often on top of that being a 212 comparison. Usually the 212 takes a back seat for me in my mind. I do majority open comparisons and then a few classic comparisons here and there, but for the 212 competitors, I hardly ever go to their division for a comparison. That's not the case today. In today's video, I'm going to compare the current 212 champion Keone Pearson against the late George Peterson. So what's the reason and thought process behind this comparison? Well, it all started with me just stumbling across some photos of George's brief stint in the 212 division. I was just marveling at those photos, but then I got to thinking. George had terrific shape. He was originally a classic competitor after all. A good one at that. He had 3 top 3 finishes in a row at the Olympia and was an Arnold Classic champion there. And when he made his jump to the 212 division, he kept those amazing lines intact, but of course with a little more mass. And it's hard to say it wasn't a winning combo. He won his first 212 show easily, the Tampa Pro, and he was immediately top 3 in his first and only 212 Olympia. The reason George was so decorated in both divisions was because of the shape. So I was thinking about how good his shape really was and thinking about this year's 212 verdict. Let's be honest, Sean Clarita beat Keone Pearson at the 2023 Olympia on those bodybuilding qualities, like muscularity, conditioning, and freak factor. But Keone ended up with the title at the end of the day because of one thing: shape. The conclusion after the 2023 Olympia was shape was going to start to matter a lot more now. So I was thinking George would have had a heyday with the shifting judging criteria. He wasn't the biggest guy, but he was complete and his aesthetics were great. I can say similar things about Keone. Keone is pretty big, but he misses a lot of that conditioning, but his shape is amazing. He has some of the best genetics ever. So that was my thought process, and here's my question. How close can George Peterson get to the current 212 champion Keone Pearson? The judging criteria favors these types of physiques even more now, and these guys are very similar, so this should be a good comparison. So let's get right into it. This is George Peterson at the 2020 Olympia, where he placed his career high at 3rd, and Keone Pearson at the 2023 Olympia, where he won his first title. If you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We have a great start here in the front double. Both guys are top notch. The front double is decided by 2 main factors: arms and structure. Well, both guys have each element, but Keone has better showings in both elements. He wins each element, and that wins him the entire pose. Like I said in the intro, Keone has some of the best genetics of all time. His structure is going to be hard for anyone to contend with in this day and age, but honestly, you can stack up most guys from any era and they'll be hard pressed to beat the structure. And these first couple of poses really tailor themselves to someone with a great structure, so Keone has a strong start here in the front double. This is one of the best X-frames I've seen, and it very well be the best out of any division today if you exclude the classic guys. His lats are incredibly wide and his rib cage is just huge. But the real kicker is the waist. With that vacuum, and right now in this pose, I doubt it measures more than 28-30 inches, which is insane. Then you go down to the legs and his quads are very wide too. The sweep on them is insane, and he's still filling the thigh gap in with good adductors. The quad separation is also very pleasing. Does he have the 2009 Jay Cutler saran wrapped super dry look to his quads? No. In fact, I think his overall condition here at this contest wasn't anything to write home about at all, but he brings the separation in where it counts. And just because he isn't the driest or the most vascular doesn't mean it isn't enough. Keone is all about aesthetics, and even his level of conditioning, at least in this pose, is aesthetic. Sometimes bringing an ultra shredded version of yourself not only hurts your shape, but makes you look a little too freaky. This is just the right amount of conditioning from the front. He can keep his fullness and the shape to his muscle bellies, and he doesn't look like an anatomy chart, but he still has all the separation he needs. Those quads are neatly separated, and the shape to them is picture perfect. They're very pleasing to look at. I know some people want that ultra shredded look. I'm usually one of those guys. I'm a stickler for conditioning, but if the new judging criteria is aesthetics first, we can't deny that sometimes being over conditioned can hurt your aesthetics. I digress, but overall this is a great set of quads, balanced, separated, with huge sweep. So let's zoom out. Keone has an incredibly small waist to begin with, but when you add in the huge rib cage and the lats and then the sweeping set of quads on the bottom, it just makes his proportions look absolutely cartoonish. And this really isn't an area where George loses per se, it's more of a Keone winning thing. George is still very good in the structure department. Keone is just on another level. George has a good X-frame too, you can't deny that. A really good one in fact, but Keone is a comic book character. And in terms of the arms, that's Keone's area too. His arms are probably his best body part. He has the peak of a short set of biceps, but they're so full and take up all the real estate between his front delt and forearm like a long set of biceps. He has the mass and really good shape. Maybe the biceps overpower his tris a little bit, but George's arms are fairly far behind for that minor detail to even matter. George's biceps are pretty short, and I'm not a huge fan of the shape. He kind of reminds me of Albert Beckles, and I definitely don't like the shape of his biceps. And overall, George's arms are just smaller. It's a good set of arms, but not like Keone's. I think most of us are going to argue that this is Keone's pose all day long, and probably his best pose. The arms are immense, and he looks like a superhero with that silhouette. Good pose for George, but this is the best of the best over on his left. Now the front lat spread is a bit of a surprise. Usually if a guy is good in the front double, those same qualities being so prevalent in the front lat spread usually lend him back-to-back wins. That's what I thought we'd see with Keone. I thought that X-Frame would carry him to victory easily in this one. But one thing messes this pose up for Keone, and oddly enough it's something that I just heaped a ton of praise on in the last pose. It's the midsection. I'll call this out right now, Keone is a genetic phenom, terrific shape, the whole 9 yards when it comes to structure, but his abs, not only are they bad, but they're getting worse. He has the abs of a pregnant woman. And no, that's not technically an insult because it's true. It's called diastasis recti. It's basically just when your abs separate. And yes, it's common with pregnant women because they have something making their stomach expand at an alarming rate. And hey, eating a bodybuilding diet is going to have similar effects. Constantly force feeding to go from classic to 212 for months on end and constantly being stuffed is not good for your waistline, let alone what drugs may be used on top of that. But just the full stomach alone for months on end has been hurting waistlines since the 90s. Some guys can handle it better than others, but Keone can't. Now, do I know 100% what caused his ab separation? No. And this does seem to be partly in Keone's genetics because he's always had this gap between his abs. It could be anything, but I'd bet the house on my explanation. But what I do know is that it is getting bigger. His abs did not look the same in classic as they do now as Keone has gotten bigger. Anyway, I find it very distracting and honestly a little gross. For me, it's just a big knock on the entire pose. His lats are good, that's an important piece of the pose obviously, and he has great sweeping quads yet again, and with these things he has a good overall X-frame. But it's not as exaggerated as in the front double. He should just do this with a vacuum from now on. Because his waist looks a little bigger here, it's small overall, but why not make it even smaller? And you can hide those poor abs. But he didn't do that, and I can't stop looking at that jarring gap in his abs. Keone also picked a pretty bad time to falter because George is even better here than he was in the front double. George's X-frame is just about equal to Keone's now. His waist got a little smaller from the front double while Keone's got bigger. Downstairs, George's legs look better too. He has a lankier build, but he still fills those quads out while maintaining some great separation in there. Going back up top, we've already talked about the midsection a little. George wins this area easily. Then going up to the actual lats themselves, I think it's pretty close. Both guys have good taper and developed lats. I think for all intents and purposes, they're basically the same. Now in terms of the delts and arms, Keone has more size, but George has much more separation. And I actually prefer George's arms for being smaller. I think Keone's arms are stealing a little bit of the focus from his lats because he is so huge in the guns department. I'll take George's lankier but leaner arms in this pose since they're not the direct focus like they were in the front double. And in the chest, that's not super important and no one is bringing anything special, but Keone has a little more fullness here so he can take a slight small win. So overall these guys are pretty similar. They're almost identical in the lats, both guys bring good legs, and both have similar shaped silhouettes. But Keone has something George doesn't, diastasis recti, and that's a good thing for George. With everything being similar in this pose but George not having a notable flaw like Keone, I have to give him this one. The side chest is back to being a good pose for each competitor. Each guy has good elements. The main one for Keone is the overall size and thickness from this angle. He's looking very wide shoulder to shoulder and he doesn't have the super long limbs like George, so he's looking more filled out. George isn't as stacked as Keone, but he has a couple of things going for him. He has better conditioning overall easily, he's much drier everywhere, and George also has the better pecs. Keone's pecs genetically don't take up that much real estate on his physique. They're kind of bunched up. George's pecs take up a lot more space on his body. That makes George's closer pec look a lot nicer. It looks like a proper shelf. And that far pec on George, the most important one, looks better too. I said Keone's chest looks a little bunched up, and on paper that should help him in this area by looking fuller, but not really. He has some okay detail here, but why would you pick Keone's chest when you have George with the larger chest in general, and the far pec just juts out more and he has more striations than Keone? So George takes a firm win of the pecs, but can Keone's size in other areas outweigh this? Well, let's see. Let's stay in the upper body for now and take a look at the arms and delt. Keone is bigger, sure, but George is so much more separated. Keone's bi and tri blend together into one big mass, and his delt is just another big mass. I have George here. I usually prefer a bigger, fuller arm and delt, but George has so much more separation, and even though he's not as big, he's got a lot of pop throughout the arm. Going slightly down, the midsections are good for both guys. It is apples and oranges though. Keone opted for the crunched abs while George opted for a half vacuum, a very classic execution. Both guys are good here, it just comes down to what you prefer. And since this isn't the main focus of the pose, I don't mind George doing a little bit of a vacuum. I like this execution more actually, but some people may want that little glimpse of a developed core and go for Keone. Either way, both guys are great. It's a tie game here in the midsection for me at least. And in the lower body, we got similar levels of mass here between the two, but I think Keone is just a little bit bigger. But in terms of conditioning, it's not close. George's separation is much cleaner and he's much drier. Keone is okay here in terms of detail, definitely better than in years past, but he misses that extra polish. I think this area can go either way. I do prefer George right now. I do like his conditioning a lot better, and like I said earlier, I'm a stickler for that. But Keone probably has enough detail and is at least even in the size department, and those things can grant him a win too. However, even if Keone got a lower body win, George is still snagging the overall win. He has better pecs and better conditioning, which helps him win both the arm and delt and the lower body, at least in my eyes. Keone has a lot of size, but it's fairly unrefined, and going body part for body part has George winning a lot more areas. Here in the rear double, George gets a clear win. Keone can't rely on his structure that much in this pose, and his back is arguably one of his worst body parts besides the midsection. And George's back is honestly his best body part. Now, Keone really has brought up his back. The upper back has a little something going on, and downstairs from the rear is an area he really brought up as a whole. If he had slightly better conditioning, he could have won this area because George's lankier limbs make his legs look a little small from some of these angles, and the back is one of them. But George wins here in the lower body because of the superior hams, mainly by way of conditioning. Now, going up to George's back, you can just see that he has a higher level of density, and he's super wide too. Those lats have a nice taper as well and insert very low. This gives the entire back a nice full look. As I said, Keone has an okay upper back, but he doesn't have those full thick lats that George does from top to bottom. George's upper back is good too, don't get me wrong. His traps aren't as big as Keone's, but he's got those rear delts, terries, and so on all coming out to play in this shot. And he also rounds out this pose with not only better delts with more mass and separation, but the arms as well. Keone has good peaks poking out here, but his tricep sweep is very poor. George has great peaks too, but the fuller and more complete arm from the top of the bi to the bottom of the tricep sweep. Overall, George is more developed in the back and has overall better conditioning, leading to another victory in the lower body and better polish head to toe. The rear lat spread gets a lot better for Keone. He's definitely super wide and the lower body looks a touch better for him here, but I still have to go with George. Keone has width, maybe even a touch more than George, but I like George's lats so much more. They're more developed, they just look meatier like they did in the last pose. Keone's back doesn't look flimsy, there's just more density that comes with more years of training present in George's back. But this pose does get closer in general compared to the rear double, not just because of the backs, but the lower body too. I actually prefer Keone now. He's posting his legs a bit better now, which brings out more detail. He's still not as shredded as George, but he is bigger. And honestly, I would give the glutes to Keone straight up. George is definitely more shredded as a whole, I think we know that by now, but the glutes are oddly devoid of a single striation. They're not soggy, they're boxed in, and just south in the hamstrings, he has plenty of dry detail. So that lack of glute detail is probably just a genetic thing more than likely. Keone wins by default because he definitely doesn't have the best conditioning, but he has enough to bring more details than George. Now in the hamstrings, I could see some people giving this area to George. He's more defined. But I like Keone. Like I said, he was always bigger here, but now he has more details. So overall, with these two things together, I would give Keone the lower body as a whole. But I do feel George does enough in the back to get a overall win on this one. It's closer, sure, George lost the lower body advantage, and Keone is wide in the back, but George's total development and density are still out of Keone's league. The next pose, the side try, is a coin flip if you ask me. Keone is more thick and massive, but a little underdone in terms of conditioning and polish. George has less thickness from the side, but is more streamlined and conditioned. Keone has more size in the side leg. George is more conditioned. Overall, I do think Keone's side leg looks a little bit better here than it did in the side chest, and George looks a little bit smaller. Because of those things, I actually prefer Keone slightly here. Going up, we have what is perhaps the key difference, the midsection. And I say key difference, but neither guy is really bad. Keone's abs are bad, we've established this, but they look okay here since they're not fully visible from a head-on angle. And he's keeping that stomach locked in and squeezing the obliques too. But I would give this area to George easily for how incredibly small his waist is. He could win alone on that streamlined midsection. Now in the pecs, I also prefer George. This goes back to what I said in the side chest. Keone's are just too small. George's pecs just have a more pleasing shape and take up more space on his torso. Now breaking down the arm, I think we see basically the same thing everywhere except a little bit of difference in the tri. Keone is a little bit meatier and he actually has some faint feathering in there. On the other hand, George's tricep is a bit thinner, but it is long and has good shape to it. Honestly, with a little bit of extra detail and being a little bit thicker, I prefer Keone slightly. But this area, like the physiques as a whole, can go either way. So zooming back out, I have Keone winning the tricep by a little bit, the side leg by a little bit, slightly losing in the abs and losing in the pecs. I can see this going either way. I almost went with George, but for now, I'm going with Keone. He wasn't the best in the midsection, but he looks much better here than from the front, and he's at least respectable. He won the tricep for me by a slight margin, and it's thicker from the side as a whole, which are the two most important things I look for. In the abs and thighs, we have two different executions, but these guys are fairly similar, at least in the lower body. I think this is basically a tie game down here. Keone may have a little more fullness, but that's debatable. Both guys have good size, and both guys have quad feathering. I can have either winning here. Now, the abs do get a bit different. Keone is not hitting this straight on like he should. I gotta knock him for that a little because you need to hit the post traditionally first, whether it's terrible or terrific, and then do variations on top of it like this one. And I looked for a head-on abs and thighs post from Keone. I searched his entire routine and comparisons, but I couldn't find one. This is because he just knows better than to hit it head on. So even though I have to give him a slight knock for not hitting the post properly, the knock I would have gave him for the terrible head-on abs and thighs post would have been even worse. Taking Keone's variation as is still is an okay shot for him. The oblique cuts are really deep here, and the abs, at least the half that faces us, look very deeply separated too. And he almost outran the gap in his abs, but we can still see something fishy going on in that area even from this angle. We can spot a little bit of that gap and a little bit of stomach protrusion. George doesn't have any of these problems. He's hitting the post head on while making it his own, and he has better abs. Keone's abs are deeper, sure, but George has a solid set devoid of flaws. And since George wins the abs and it was a tie game to maybe a tiny loss in the wheels, I gotta go with George here as the winner. I'm sure some of you are going to disagree, and I can see the arguments, but take this as a way for me to dock Keone for the very big issue that is the abs. He does a very good job at hiding it, but it's still present. I think George's pose is more complete while being traditional, and I have to punish Keone for the major flaw, and the abs and thighs is a good way for me to do that. In the most muscular, I could only find one variation for George, so he has to contend with two versions that Keone brings. But honestly, even out of these three picks, my eyes always go back to George. Now, Keone is more muscular. George may have just as much muscle overall, but he has such long limbs to fill out. So even if they have the same amount of muscle mass pound for pound, George is not going to look as muscular because his muscle is more spread out. And besides that, I do think Keone may bring just a little more muscle in general. In the hands clasped, he's got thicker arms and wins the lower body from this angle. Those legs look massive. And in the crab variation, the delts and arms look very thick and the traps are mountainous. So Keone is more muscular, or at minimum appears to be more muscular. But George is looking like a statue. For one, he can make up a little for his lack of size because he's very full. He's popping a lot more than Keone, but Keone has a little more actual size. And the main thing going for George, the thing that's drawing my eyes, is the level of detail. More chest striations, more separation in the arms, and really everywhere besides the legs. And I do think even though George is slightly less muscular, he does score some wins. They're fuller, they're more striated, and Keone's pecs are especially flat in the hands clasped. George also has a better midsection, no surprise there, it's no contest. And honestly, the abs on Keone's hands clasp pose are threatening to ruin another pose for him. I'm sure some people can get over it better than I can, maybe it's not that bad, but personally I see it as a major flaw. If I cringe even just a little bit in disgust by looking at something on your physique, that's a big flaw to me. And honestly, between the smaller chest and the gaped abs, I do have George over Keone when they're both hitting the hands clasped. Now, I'm reluctant to give George the entire pose because Keone brings two versions, and he does look a lot better in the crab, and after all, he's winning the namesake of the pose by being more muscular. So really, if you want just the most massive guy, go with Keone. However, I think George is big enough and full enough to allow his much superior details and polish pull him over the finish line. Keone has a couple of flaws. George is a bit smaller, but George's polish keeps my eyes on him at all times. He looks like a statue and is much more impressive to me. This pose is a great one to end off with though, it really can go either way. Well, these guys ended up being a lot more similar than I thought they would be. And I don't just mean physically. As I was going through each gentleman's competition history, there were similar patterns. Both guys started out in Classic, they both went on to the 212 in 2020, and they're both 212 Tampa Pro champions. And yes, their physiques are similar in some ways, but at the same time very different in others. Some shots were won easily in this comparison, others were a coin flip. So here's the verdict. George Peterson on paper easily wins with 6 poses to Keone's 2. But like I said, this doesn't exactly paint the full picture. Some shots were dominant. I think the back shots are pretty easily won by George, and Keone had a dominant win in the front double. Then we also had some shots that weren't total open shut cases, but were pretty strong wins. I would consider the side chest and the front lat spread 2 poses that fall into the win category. Maybe not dominant wins, but ones that I feel the majority of us would have had George winning. Keone doesn't have any of these types of poses. And then we had a couple of nail biters. I think the most muscular and maybe even the abs and thighs to an extent can be swayed in Keone's favor depending on who you are. And I definitely could have had George winning the side try. Overall, if we gave those poses that were really close to Keone, at best he is making this a tie game 4-4. So overall, what this tells me is that George's margin of victory in this one was pretty large. I'd have to start jumping through a couple of hoops to get Keone across the finish line, let alone to just tie this one up. This is not quite what I expected, and neither did you guys. I put out a poll before this video asking you guys who you think would win, and the vast majority of you guys had Keone winning this one. I gotta disagree here. Keone has the aesthetics in his pocket, but the chinks in his armor are his conditioning and a couple of muscle groups here and there. Keone won the Olympia this year because because the only one that was even close to him was Sean Clarita. That's why there was a top 2 call out. The judges thought they were in a league of their own. And Sean ended up losing the title this year. Why? He had the freak factor and was definitely more complete and more shredded, no doubt. But his physique is not that appealing to look at all. And he runs really far behind in that category next to Keone. Keone is behind in completeness and conditioning, but not as far as Sean was behind in shape. And shape is just being weighted more now. We saw that across all divisions this year. Whether you agree or disagree, it's just a fact. So with Keone's big win in the shape department, he was over to prevail over the entire 212 lineup. Well, what happens when someone does nail their conditioning, is complete, and also has killer shape? Keone gets his major strength disarmed while getting exposed for being underdone in a lot of ways. Now over George, I do still think Keone has better shape. He has bigger, wider legs, it is extremely wide up top and in the rib cage, so he's got the shape but on a bigger frame. So he's going to have more exaggerated proportions. George has a small waist and all of that, but he has a lankier build. He has good proportions and whatnot. He's not unaesthetic by any means. Keone just looks like a comic book character. Now for about every other metric, I have to go with George. Muscle maturity, George. Completeness, George. Conditioning, George. Having less flaws, George. The only thing I can think of to maybe give to Keone is a little more overall muscularity. But like I said, George is more complete and Keone doesn't have the best condition, so he's just a bit bigger, not automatically better. And Keone had a major flaw in the abs. It lost him a pose or two, and some may consider his back to be a big enough problem to also call it a notable flaw. While George doesn't really have any problems that are big enough to be worth noting. So in today's comparison, I have to go with the 2020 Olympia George Peterson, even over the current 212 champ Keone Pearson. Like I said, Keone won his title based on shape, and he lagged a little bit behind in muscularity, completeness, and conditioning. But in this comparison, George brought a strong showing in both, beating him in 2 out of the 3 categories besides shape. And even then, he'd have some of the best shape on the 212 stage if he was around today. And that brings up another point. This is 2020 George. These pics were taken from his first 212 Olympia. George was just getting started. And if I have George getting a win over Keone with his first Olympia version, how would George have looked in 2023? Well, I think then it would have been an easier victory. George was going to get slightly bigger and so on. And I do think he could have been Mr. Olympia at least once, so we could have had a situation where not only George would have been better, but also be a potential reigning champ and or past Olympia winner. But unfortunately, we'll never see that scenario. But even with what was probably going to be one of George's inferior versions by the end of his career, I still feel he beats Keone. I think today's era with shape being more prevalent suits both guys, but it's still bodybuilding. George has it all. Good shape, good condition, good completeness. I think it would have been enough to beat Keone this year, and it is enough for him to win this comparison today. So today, my winner is the late George Peterson. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and let me know who you had winning this comparison. By the way, if you guys are looking for any high quality supplements with some of the best ingredient labels out there, check out armsracenutrition.com. All their pre-workouts have top-notch formulas behind them. They have different types of proteins to suit your needs and much more. Whatever you put in your cart though, be sure to use my code PROJECT10 at checkout for 10% off your entire order. That's code PROJECT10 at armsracenutrition.com. With all that said, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Got no doubt, I know I will go so far. Oh, I'm gonna have my name in the stars. Set my goal up high and do what I love. Gotta get that Lexia, gotta get that Lexia.